June 1944. A convoy of tired German prisoners of war stepped off a military train somewhere in Texas, their boots scraping the dusty ground as the hot wind carried the smell of grass and diesel. They had crossed the Atlantic blindfolded, exhausted, and expecting the worst. Many imagined the fabled enemy camps as places of punishment, dark barracks, starvation, humiliation. But what greeted them instead left them speechless. Rows of neatly built wooden barracks stood behind fences topped with barbed wire. American guards in clean khaki uniforms watched quietly, rifles slung casually over their shoulders, not threatening, just vigilant. And then the smell hit them, freshly baked bread, roasted meat, and something sweet, almost unreal, vanilla ice cream. The prisoners exchanged looks of disbelief. Some whispered that this must be a trick, a psychological tactic, a part of the propaganda machine to make them think America was a paradise. But when the food was served, generous portions of beef stew, mashed potatoes, white bread, and cold milk, disbelief turned to silence. Corporal Hans Reiter, once stationed in Normandy, stared at the plate in front of him. "But butter, real butter," he muttered in German. "We haven't seen this since before the war." That night, under the bright Texas moon, the camp buzzed with quiet confusion. Were the Americans really feeding their enemies like this? Or was this all a show for captured men who might never go home? Little did they know, this wasn't propaganda. It was everyday America in 1944. A nation whose industrial abundance extended even to those who had fought against it.
Over the following weeks, disbelief slowly gave way to astonishment. The German prisoners began to realize that what they had seen on the first day wasn't a performance. It was normal life inside an American prisoner of war camp. Each morning, bugles sounded across the open compounds as the men lined up for breakfast. Eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee, strong enough to wake an army. For soldiers who had survived on watery soup and stale bread on the Eastern Front, it felt surreal, like stepping into another world. In Camp Swift, Texas, and later in Fort Robinson, Nebraska, the daily rhythm of life followed a strangely humane routine. The prisoners worked in nearby farms, lumber yards, or kitchens under supervision, earning small wages they could spend on cigarettes, stationery, or even chocolate. Inside the camp canteen, American soldiers and German POWs sometimes stood in the same line, separated only by uniform color. At lunchtime, steaming trays were handed out: roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. To many of the men, this wasn't just food. It was a revelation. Private Karl Vogt, who once fought near Cherbourg, later recalled, "We thought the Americans wanted to make us believe they lived in luxury, so we would lose faith in Germany. But after months, we understood. They really did live like this." Letters written home, when censorship allowed, often carried the same stunned tone. "They give us ice cream every week." It's not propaganda, it's reality. Some of the guards, young Americans barely older than the prisoners, treated them with polite indifference rather than hatred. They shared cigarettes, traded jokes, and on Sundays, some even joined the POWs for baseball games inside the wire fences. It was a strange coexistence: war and humanity, discipline and compassion, all contained within the borders of a camp. And for the Germans who had grown up under years of Nazi propaganda about decadent America, the experience was disorienting. They began to question everything they'd been told. How could a country that lived like this, so rich, so calm, so generous, ever have been the monster their leaders described? By the winter of 1944, something remarkable had begun to happen behind the fences. What started as suspicion turned into quiet respect, even admiration. The German POWs, once convinced that American generosity was an illusion, slowly began to understand that they were witnessing the real face of the United States, a country built on abundance, order, and discipline, even in wartime. Inside Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the prisoners were allowed to organize small orchestras, paint, build furniture, and even run classes. Some studied English or mathematics using books provided by the Red Cross. Others repaired shoes or helped in the camp hospital. The Americans encouraged work, but they also encouraged dignity, a word that many prisoners thought had vanished from the vocabulary of war. At mealtimes, the dining hall buzzed with the sound of cutlery and laughter. The Germans still wore their faded field uniforms, marked PW, but for a few moments each day, they forgot the humiliation of defeat. Plates of meatloaf, corn, and fruit salad filled the tables, followed by something they never imagined tasting again: ice cream with chocolate syrup. Photographs from the time show young men, once enemies, smiling as they eat together under the glaring American sun. For many, it was more than comfort. It was revelation. They began to question the world they had come from. "We were told that Americans were slaves of capitalism," wrote one prisoner later. "But we saw that even their soldiers ate like kings and treated us better than our officers did. Camp life became a strange kind of mirror, one that reflected not propaganda, but contrast. The United States had turned its wealth into a weapon more powerful than bullets, the power to show mercy, even to the enemy. And as rumors of Germany's crumbling front lines reached them, the POWs realized that the war they had once thought righteous had already been lost, not only on the battlefield, but in the moral balance between nations. At night, when the floodlights lit the fences, many prisoners lay awake, staring at the stars over America, wondering what kind of future could exist after this, and whether they would ever see home again. When the war finally ended in 1945, and the surrender of Germany was announced, many of those German prisoners stood silently inside the camps, unsure whether to feel relief or shame. The barbed wire that had once defined their captivity now felt like a border between two worlds: the harsh, broken Europe they had left behind, and the strange, civilized America that had treated them like human beings. One by one, the men were processed for repatriation. Trains rolled out of Texas, Iowa, Nebraska, and Georgia, carrying thousands of POWs toward the ports that would take them back to a devastated homeland. At the final roll call, American guards shook hands with the men who had once been their enemies. Some exchanged photographs or addresses, promising to write, and many of them actually did. Private Fritz Langemann, who had spent 2 years in Camp Swift, later said, "When I stepped back onto German soil, I was grateful to be free. But part of me missed the camp. It was the first place I ever tasted fairness back in Germany. The returnees spoke quietly of what they had seen: the food, the respect, the abundance. To families struggling to find bread in the ruins, their stories sounded like fairy tales. Yet these tales carried a quiet truth: that victory, at its core, was not only about weapons or armies, but about values, how a nation treated even those who had fought against it. Historians later noted that the experience of German POWs in America planted a seed, a different understanding of democracy, fairness, and humanity. Many of those men would later help rebuild post-war Germany with new ideas of justice and dignity. Today, in old black and white photographs preserved in archives, you can still see them: rows of German prisoners smiling beside American guards, plates of food in hand, laughter frozen in time. They had come as enemies, expecting cruelty, and left as men forever changed by kindness. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson of war is not how to fight, but how to forgive.